Most people who see a man like Reese Calder sitting on a front porch step at 3 in the morning assume the worst. They see the cut, the size, the Harley at the curb still ticking from the heat of a long ride. They see the skull and wrench patch on his back and the road grime on his boots, and the way a man like that takes up space even when he is sitting still. Especially when he is sitting still, they see threat, they see trouble. They see something that does not belong in a quiet residential neighborhood on a Tuesday night in the cold November rain. Margaret Ellison had believed this about men like Reese Calder for 51 years. She had not arrived at this belief carelessly. She had arrived at it the way a person arrives at a belief that has been confirmed repeatedly over a long life by a long series of specific incidents that added up to a conclusion she had never found reason to revise. She had been taught it by her mother, who had moved to the other side of the street when men like this were coming. She had refined it through 34 years of marriage to a man who did not ride motorcycles, but who had, in the end, turned out to be the most dangerous person in her life. She had held it intact and unexamined for all of those years, and it had served her in its way, had given her a category, a direction in which to point her vigilance, a clear line between safe and unsafe that she could see from a distance. She had been wrong about the line. It had simply been drawn in the wrong place. She understood this for the first time at 5:47 in the morning on a Wednesday in November, when she opened her front door and found Reese Calder still on her porch step, still there, soaking wet, back against the doorframe, the rain having come and gone and come again through the night. And he had not moved. He had a paper coffee cup from the gas station 3 blocks down that had long since gone cold, and a phone he had not looked at, and the Harley still at the curb and his eyes open because he had not slept. He had simply stayed. He looked up at her when the door opened. He said, "Morning." Margaret Ellison stood in her doorway in her bathrobe and her slippers and looked at this man, this soaking, road-worn, patches and skull tattoo man who had sat in the cold November for 7 hours outside her door without being asked, and felt something shift in her chest that had been fixed in the same position for 51 years. She said, "You must be frozen." He said, "Little bit," she said. "Come in and I'll make coffee." And he did what had brought him to that porch step, and what had kept him there through the rain and the cold and the long dark of a November night is a story that the town of Sycamore Falls, Ohio, would talk about for a very long time. Not because it was loud. It was not loud. Not because anything dramatic happened on that porch. Nothing dramatic did. But because of what a man's decision to simply stay said about who he was, and what it said about who she had decided, without ever looking closely enough, that men like him could never be. Sycamore Falls sits in the northeastern corner of Ohio where the land goes flat and the sky comes in wide and the winters arrive early and stay long. And the towns are the kind of towns that were built around something, a factory, a rail stop, a mill, that is gone now, leaving behind the infrastructure of a purpose that has been renegotiated into something quieter. The streets are wide and the houses are older and well kept in the way of people who take pride in what they have, and the trees are exactly what the name promises. Sycamores, massive, their pale bark visible from 3 blocks away, their leaves down by the first week of November, and the branches bare against the gray Ohio sky. The diner was called Kepler's, which was the family name of the people who had run it for 4 generations, and the current Kepler was a woman named Sue, who had taken it over from her father 15 years ago, and who ran it with the specific efficiency of someone who has been watching how it's done since childhood and has been ready for a long time. She knew her regulars. She knew their orders. She knew the difference between a person who wanted conversation and a person who wanted to be left alone with their coffee, which was its own form of sophisticated intelligence. Reese Calder had been a regular since May. He took the back booth on the right, the one with the sight line to the door and the parking lot. He came in on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and sometimes Sunday evenings, and he ordered the same thing, coffee, black, eggs over easy wheat toast, and he ate alone and read something on his phone and left a tip that was consistently better than the bill required. He had been riding with the Iron Sycamore chapter out of Akron for 11 years. He was 48 old and built in the way of men who have done physical work for decades, the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that is simply present in the way he moved, and the way he held himself, and the way the room noted him and adjusted without fanfare. He was quiet. That was the thing people who knew him said first. Not unfriendly, quiet. He had a few words for Sue when she brought the coffee, and a few more for the men he rode with, and not many beyond that. And this was not shyness and not coldness, but the particular economy of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that words were worth more when you used fewer of them. He was heading somewhere specific the Tuesday he had come to Creed's. He was heading to a chapter run in Medina, an overnight trip 2 days out, and he had stopped at Kepler's at 6:30 for eggs and coffee, and what turned out to be, unexpectedly, the clearest 40 minutes of observation he'd had in years. He had been the only person in the diner that morning who was paying attention. If you're new here, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments before we go any further. I want to know where this story finds you. Anywhere in the world. I read everyone now. Back to Kepler's. Back to that Tuesday morning. Because there was a woman in the corner booth who had been sitting there since before Reese arrived, and he had noticed her the way he noticed things, quietly, completely, without making a production of it. And what he saw was going to change both their lives in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Her name was Margaret Louise Ellison. She was 73 years old, and she had lived in Sycamore Falls for 41 of those years, in the house on Birch Creek Road, with a sycamore tree in the front yard that had been small when they moved in and was now enormous, its roots lifting the sidewalk in 2 places, in a way that the city had been going to address for 3 years. She had raised 2 children in that house, David, who lived in Columbus, and Patricia, who lived in Portland, and she had been, for most of those years, the kind of woman the town knew. Organized, capable, involved in the things that needed involvement, the one who brought the casseroles and remembered the birthdays and could be counted on to show up when showing up was required. She had retired from showing up in the way she used to after the divorce, not all at once. Gradually, the way things contract when the energy to maintain them has been redirected towards survival. She still went to church. She still had her coffee at Kepler's on Tuesday mornings, because it was the habit of 20 years. And the booth in the corner was hers in the way that things belong to people who have used them long enough. But the committee work had gone, and the neighborhood association had gone, and the dinners for 12 had been reduced to dinners for 1 or 2, because cooking for 12 required a version of herself she was still in the quiet process of reconstructing. The divorce had been finalized 14 months ago, 34 years of marriage to a man who had been, in public, exactly what you would want: steady, successful, respected, and in private the specific, patient, intimate work of making her smaller. It had been so gradual she had not named it for 20 years. She had named other things, her own sensitivity, her own difficulty, the ways she was sometimes too much and sometimes not enough. She had accepted these names and worked on herself, and the marriage had continued, which she had taken for a long time, as evidence that she was doing the right things. It was her daughter Patricia who had said on a phone call 3 years ago, "Mom, what he's doing has a name, and the name isn't your fault." Margaret had not believed this at first. She had believed it by degrees, the way you believe difficult things. Slowly, with resistance, with the particular grief of understanding that what you spent decades surviving was not, in fact, the ordinary weight of an ordinary life. The divorce had been his idea, in the end. His, because she had finally, at the age of 72, told him plainly what she had spent 34 years declining to say. And he had not been able to continue with someone who had stopped being available to his version of events. He had moved to a condominium in Akron. He had remarried in 6 months, a woman 20 years younger, and this had been described by his friends as him moving on, and by Margaret privately, in the kitchen of the Birch Creek Roadhouse, as confirmation of what she had always suspected, that she had never been the point. She was doing better. That was the honest answer when Patricia asked. She was doing better in the way of a person who has put down something very heavy and is still getting used to how light her arms feel, surprised by it, still occasionally reaching for the weight out of habit, recalibrating. She had one problem she had not told Patricia about. His name was Dennis. Dennis Ellison was 61 years old and had been, for 34 years, the man Margaret had married. He was now, for 14 months, her ex-husband, a distinction he did not appear to find meaningful in the way the law intended it to be meaningful. He called on Tuesday and Thursday evenings between 7 and 9 with the patient regularity of someone who has decided that consistency is its own form of pressure. He did not threaten. He never had. He did not need to. He used the tools that had always worked. The familiar voice, the specific detail that reminded her he knew her completely, The question framed as concern that was actually inventory. How are you managing the furnace? It was always difficult in winter. Have you had the car checked? You were never careful about that. David mentioned you seemed tired. I hope you're not overdoing it, he pressed, with the precision of a man who had spent 3 decades learning exactly where to press on the bruises he himself had left. He had begun, in the last month, to drive past the house. She had seen the car twice, the silver Audi, his, on Birch Creek Road, at hours when there was no reason for him to be on Birch Creek Road. She had not been certain it was him the first time. She had been certain the second time. She had stood at the window and watched the car slow in front of the house and not stop and continue on, and she had stood there after it was gone and felt, for the first time since the divorce was finalized, afraid in the specific way she had been afraid in her own home for 30 years. She had not called the police. She had not been certain enough, she told herself. She had not been certain it was him for long enough to make the call. She had not wanted to seem, and here was the word she always found, the word she had been applying to herself for 3 decades, dramatic. She had come to Kepler's on Tuesday morning with the weight of this in her chest, sitting in her corner booth with her coffee, trying to decide if what she was feeling was evidence or anxiety, real or imagined, the kind of thing a person called the police about, or the kind of thing a person managed alone. She was still sitting with this at 7:15 when Dennis walked through the door. She saw him before he saw her. He was wearing the good coat, the charcoal wool one she had helped him choose 8 years ago at a store in Cleveland, the one he wore when he wanted to look like a particular kind of man. He scanned the diner with the systematic attention of someone looking for something specific, and his eyes found her in the corner booth, and his expression arranged itself into the configuration she knew better than any other expression she had ever studied: concern, warmth, the presentation of a man who was simply glad to see her. He came to her booth. He did not ask if he could sit. He sat. "Margaret," he said, "I thought that was your car." She felt her hands go still around the coffee cup. This was what he did. He made everything feel like coincidence, like his presence was simply what happened when their lives overlapped naturally, like she was the one who needed to explain why she was not glad to see him. "Dennis," she said. "You look tired," he said, with the specific gentleness that had a hook in it she knew by feel. "Are you sleeping?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been worried," he said. "The house, the winter coming. I drove past last week, and the gutter on the east side is coming loose. Did you know that? I can have someone look at it." She looked at her coffee. She did not say, "I know you drove past." She did not say, "I watched you from the window." She did not say any of the things that were true, because saying true things to Dennis had always required a price. She was still calculating whether she could afford. "I'm handling it," she said. "You don't have to handle everything alone," he said, and leaned forward slightly. And she recognized the lean. The lean was intimacy deployed as encroachment, the physical reminder of 34 years of shared space, and her hands, still around the coffee cup, trembled once. She stopped them. She did not look up. In the back booth on the right, a man named Reese Calder had stopped reading whatever was on his phone. He was watching. He had not moved. He was watching the way a man watches when he has seen this specific configuration before and knows what it is and is deciding how long to wait. Dennis reached across the table and put his hand over hers. "Let me help." She pulled her hand away. It was a small motion, barely visible. She pulled it into her lap and looked out the window at the sycamore trees on the main street, bare in the November morning, and she breathed once in a way that was not quite steady. Nobody in the diner said anything. Sue was behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand, not moving. The trucker at the far end had gone still over his plate. Dennis looked around the diner, not at anyone, through anyone, with the comfortable confidence of a man who has never, in 61 years, been called to account in a public room, and then he reached into his coat pocket and set a key on the table. Margaret's key, the spare she had given him in 1989, and asked for back 14 months ago, and he had said he didn't have it anymore. He set it on the table between them. "I found it," he said. "I thought I'd return it." He smiled. The thing about the key was that it was not a gift. Margaret understood this immediately, understood it the way she understood all of Dennis's specific language, which was not what it presented as. The key was not being returned. It was being displayed. It was information. "I had this the whole time. I could have used it. I chose to show you instead of use it. For now." She looked at the key. She did not pick it up. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the key on the table in front of her, and she was making the calculation she had been making since Tuesday the week before, when she'd seen the silver Audi slow in front of the house, trying to decide if this was evidence or anxiety, real or imagined, dramatic or legitimate. The key was evidence. She reached for it. Dennis's hand came down on top of hers, not hard, not painful, simply there, his hand on her hand on the key, covering both, the familiar pressure, the reminder. "We should talk," he said, properly. "I'll drive you." "No," she said. "Margaret." "No." She looked up. She found his eyes with hers, and she held them, which was harder than it sounded, which was something she had not always been able to do. "Take your hand off mine," she said. He didn't. His expression didn't change. That was the worst part. It never changed. The concern, the warmth, the presentation of a man who was simply trying to help. And that was when Reese Calder set down his coffee. He didn't shout. He didn't stand up fast. He stood the way he always moved, without announcing it, simply arriving at his full height in the way that some men arrive at their full height, which is a different thing from just standing up. He walked to the corner booth. He stopped beside the table. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at Dennis's hand on Margaret's hand on the key. He looked at Dennis. "Take your hand off her," he said. Dennis looked up. He took in the cut and the patches and the size of the man beside his booth, and the particular quality of stillness that was not stillness, but controlled force, and he made the calculation that was so automatic for him. The social calculation, the hierarchy calculation, the assessment of who had the institutional weight in a given room. "This is a private conversation," Dennis said, in his reasonable voice. She said no, Reese said, twice. "X," Reese said, one word. The diner went so quiet that the sound of the November rain on the windows was the loudest thing in the room. Dennis looked around, at Sue behind the counter, at the trucker at the end, at the three other people who had been pretending to eat and were no longer pretending. He looked back at Reese. For the first time in 61 years, the calculation did not come back in his favor. He took his hand off Margaret's. He straightened his good coat. He stood up with the careful dignity of a man performing composure, and he picked up his coffee, and he said, "I'll be in touch, Margaret," in the voice that was supposed to sound like normalcy and sounded, with Reese Calder standing there, like what it was. He walked out. Margaret sat very still. The key was on the table. She picked it up. She held it in her fist the way you hold something when you are not yet sure what to do with it, but you are sure you are not letting go. Reese stood beside the booth for a moment. "You all right?" he said. She looked up at him. She had believed all her life that men like this were the danger. She had believed it with the completeness of a conviction never seriously examined. And she sat in her corner booth in Kepler's diner with her ex-husband's retreating footsteps still audible on the sidewalk outside, and looked at the man who had just stood between her and the only danger she had ever actually been in, and she did not have a category for this. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, "Thank you." He nodded. He went back to his booth. He finished his coffee. He left. She sat for a long time after he was gone. She called Patricia that evening. She told her about the car on Birch Creek Road. She told her about the key. She told her about what had happened at Kepler's. She told her for the first time that she had been afraid. Patricia said, "Mom, you need to talk to someone at the police department. Not to report, just to document. Build a record." "I know," Margaret said. "Will you?" "Tomorrow morning," Margaret said. She went to bed at 10. She woke at 2 to the sound of something on Birch Creek Road. She went to the window. The silver Audi was parked across the street. Engine off, lights off. Just the car sitting there in the November dark, in the rain that had started at midnight and was now coming down in cold, steady sheets. She stood at the window and looked at it. She thought about what it meant that he had come here in the middle of the night, in the rain. She thought about the key she had put in her jewelry box. She thought about calling the police and the word dramatic that she still, despite everything, had not finished clearing from her own vocabulary. She was still standing at the window when headlights appeared at the end of Birch Creek Road, a single motorcycle. It came slowly down the street and pulled to the curb 3 houses down from the Audi, and the engine cut, and Reese Calder got off the bike in the rain and stood for a moment looking at the silver car across from Margaret's house. He had gone home after the diner. He had thought about what he'd seen. He had thought about the key placed on the table and the hand that hadn't moved when she'd said no, and the calculation in the man's eyes when he'd done the math and decided a public room was still his room. He had thought about these things through the afternoon and the evening, And he had made a phone call to the chapter, and then he had gotten on the bike. He walked to Margaret's porch. He sat on the step. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the bell. It was 2 in the morning, and she was presumably asleep, and he was not there to disturb her. He was simply there. That was all. Margaret watched from the upstairs window. She watched him settle onto the step with his back against the door frame. She watched the Audi across the street. She watched for a long time, until she understood that Reese Calden was not going anywhere, and that as long as he was on that step, the man in the silver Audi was not coming to her door. She went back to bed. She slept. It was the first time in 14 months she had slept without waking at 3. At 4:15, the Audi's lights came on. Dennis had been sitting in that car for 2 hours in the November rain, watching a man on the porch of Margaret's house who had not moved and showed no sign of moving. He had waited with the patience that had always served him. He had expected the man to leave. He had expected cold and rain and time to accomplish what they usually accomplished, which was the diminishment of other people's resolve. Reese's resolve was not diminished. At 4:15, Dennis Ellison started the engine and pulled away from the curb and drove down Birch Creek Road and turned left onto Maple and was gone. At 5:47, Margaret opened the front door. She found Reese on the step, back against the door frame, soaking wet, the paper coffee cup cold in his hand, his eyes open because he had not slept. "Morning," he said. She looked at him for a long time. "You must be frozen," she said. "Come in and I'll make coffee," she said. He came inside and sat at her kitchen table and wrapped both hands around the mug she gave him, and neither of them said much for a while, because neither of them needed to. There is a kind of understanding that happens between people who have been in the same situation from different sides of a door and emerged into the same morning, and this was that kind of understanding, and it did not require words. She said, eventually, "How did you know where I lived?" She said, "I called her after the diner, told her what I'd seen, asked if she knew you." Margaret looked at her coffee. "I have to go to the police station today." She said, "I know," he said. "I'll go with you if you want." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she said. "You don't know me." He thought about it. "You said no," he said, and then you said it again, and he still didn't move. He looked at the window, the empty street outside, the sycamore tree in the gray Ohio morning. Nobody should have to say it more than once. Engines, 43 of them, arriving on Birch Creek Road on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later, not in the middle of the night, not in the rain, but on a clear November morning when the whole street could see. Iron Sycamore chapter, with riders from 2 neighboring clubs who had heard what had happened at Kepler's, through the channels those things travel, who had come not for a confrontation, but for the opposite of a confrontation, for the visible, undeniable, impossible to misread statement of presence that 43 motorcycles parked on a residential street make simply by being there. They stayed for 4 hours. They did not block the street. They did not cause a disturbance. 3 of them helped Margaret's neighbor, an 80-year-old man named Carl, who had come out of his house to see what the noise was and had ended up in a 20-minute conversation with Reese about his Korean War service, carry a storm door that had been leaning against Carl's garage for 6 months up to the frame where it belonged. The silver Audi was not seen on Birch Creek Road that day. It was not seen the following week. It was not seen again. Margaret had filed the police report the morning after the porch, with Reese beside her in the waiting room, and the documentation had begun. Dennis Ellison had received a call from an Akron detective 3 days later, a calm professional call, the kind that communicates clearly that a record exists and is being added to. He had said in his reasonable voice that he was not sure what the concern was, that he had simply been in the neighborhood. The detective had noted this for the record. The record continued to grow. He did not come back. Margaret got the locks changed on the 3rd day. She got the gutter repaired on the 4th by a contractor she found herself, because she was a woman who could find a contractor, who had always been able to find a contractor, who had simply stopped believing that about herself somewhere in 34 years of being told she couldn't manage without help. She started sleeping through the night, not all at once, by degrees, the way recovery happens when the thing that was keeping you awake has been removed and your body is slowly learning to trust the silence. In December, she came to Kepler's on Tuesday morning and took her corner booth, and Sue brought her coffee, and she sat and looked at the back booth on. The right and Reese Calden was there, the way he always was. Eggs, wheat toast, something on his phone. He looked up when she sat down. He nodded. She nodded back. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was the nod of two people who had been on the same porch in different ways, on a November night, and had arrived at the same morning and understood each other without needing to make it into more than it was. She ordered breakfast. She had not ordered breakfast at Kepler's in 11 years. She ate. She thought about 51 years of a belief held without examination, and about a man sitting in the rain for 7 hours on a stranger's porch step, and about how the most dangerous person in her life had worn a charcoal wool coat and carried the keys she'd asked him to return, and how the man she had been afraid of had sat in the cold until the danger went away. She thought about what it meant to have been wrong about where the line was. She thought it was not too late to redraw it. She left Kepler's at 9:15. She walked down the main street under the bare sycamore trees and the wide Ohio sky, and she did not hurry, because there was nowhere she had to be, and she was learning, at 73, the particular freedom of a woman who has put something down and is just beginning to understand how far she can walk without it. There are people in every town who will sit in the rain for you, not because they know you, not because they owe you anything, because they were paying attention when everyone else had looked away, and they made a decision that the word no means something, and that some things you simply do not walk past. Margaret Ellison had believed all her life that the danger wore a certain cut and rode a certain kind of motorcycle. She learned, on a November morning in Ohio, that the most important things you believe are sometimes the ones you've never thought to question, and it is never too late to look again. If this story found you today, if you believe that the right person showing up changes everything, hit like and share it with someone who needs to remember that goodness is closer than they think. Subscribe so you're here for the next one, and drop a comment below. Tell me about a time someone stayed when they didn't have to, or a time you were the one who stayed. I want to read everyone.